You've been paying attention to the housing market. Something probably feels off. Mortgage rates are still high, home prices haven't collapsed. Some houses are getting multiple offers, and others are sitting on the market for months. And in many parts of Austin, rent is actually getting cheaper. At the same time, the Federal Reserve meets again this week, which means millions of Americans are once again wondering whether borrowing money is finally about to get cheaper. So, what exactly is happening? Why does the ownership market still feel expensive while the rental market is getting more competitive? Why are some homes still getting multiple offers while others sit on the market for months? And why does it feel like national headlines never quite match what's happening on the ground? Today, we're connecting the dots between interest rates, Austin real estate, global trade, and why all of those stories affect your wallet. I'm Kyle Grimshaw, and this is the Texas Market Brief. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. I'm Kyle Grimshaw with the Grimshaw Home Group. Today is Monday, July 27th, 2026. If you're new here, this isn't just a channel that just reports news. We explain why it matters. Politics, business, housing, technology, economics, because sooner or later, they all affect your everyday life. And today's story is really about something a lot of people are struggling to make sense of: why the housing market still feels tight, even though it no longer feels hot. Let's get started. One of the biggest stories this week isn't something that's happened yet, it's something that's about to happen. The Federal Reserve begins its two-day meeting tomorrow, with its interest rate decision expected on Wednesday, July 29th. Right now, most economists still expect the Fed to leave rates unchanged, even though inflation concerns and recent energy price pressure have made the conversation more complicated. Now, before we go any further, let's clear up one common misconception. The Federal Reserve does not directly set mortgage rates. The Fed controls short-term borrowing costs between banks. Mortgage rates are driven much more by the bond market and by what investors believe inflation will do over the next several years. That's why mortgage rates can move even when the Fed doesn't. As of July 23rd, Freddie Mac says the average 30-year fixed mortgage was 6.58%, while the average 15 fixed year mortgage was 5.96%. So even before the Fed says a word this week, the real issue for housing is not just what does the Fed do? It's what do markets believe come next? Because housing isn't priced based on today's economy. It's priced based on what people think tomorrow's economy will look like. This is probably the question I get asked more than any other. If rates are making it harder to buy a house, why doesn't the Fed just lower them? Well, that's because the Fed doesn't actually control, and it's not the Fed's job. The Fed has two primary responsibilities. First one is keeping inflation under control, and keeping unemployment low is the second. Lower rates encourage borrowing. Borrowing encourages spending, and spending helps businesses. But too much spending can also make inflation worse. So the Fed is constantly trying to balance those two goals. And that balance gets even harder when inflation is no longer coming from just one place. It can come from energy, from wages, from trade policy, from supply chains, and from global uncertainty. So sometimes the smartest move is not making a move at all. And that's part of why markets spend so much time trying to interpret not just what the Fed does, but why it does it. We'll see what they decide on Wednesday. This is where national headlines become local. Mortgage rates in the mid 6% range have created what's often called the lock-in effect. A lot of homeowners refinanced into mortgages between roughly 2.5% to 3% just a few years ago. So today, even if they want a different house, moving can mean giving up a historically cheap mortgage and taking on a dramatically more expensive payment. People don't always stay because they love their house. Sometimes they stay because they love their mortgage. Economists call this the lock-in effect. I call it the golden handcuffs of real estate. And that matters because it keeps a lot of potential inventory off the market. But Austin also has something many markets still don't have: more supply and more negotiating room. That's why this market feels so strange. It's not frozen, it's just uneven. Buyers today often have more choices than they've had in several years. That means we're seeing more price reductions, more seller concessions, longer days on market, more negotiation. That is a very different market from what we experienced during the pandemic. And now, let's talk about rentals. This is where the story really splits. One of the things most people don't realize is that apartment projects take years to complete. So many of the apartment units opening today were started years ago. They're just now hitting the market. That means more supply. And more supply means more competition between apartment communities, more move-in incentives, and softer rents. Pew reported that Austin added roughly 120,000 housing units from 2015 to 2024. That's a 30% increase in housing stock. And by January 2026, Austin's median rent had fallen from 1546 in December of 21 to now a $1,296 monthly payment. Realtor.com's June 2026 rent report says Austin's median asking rent was down to $1,371 a month. That's a 4.3% year over year decrease. And that's helped a large supply pipeline of new multifamily housing. So today, the ownership market and the rental market are not telling the same story. Buying remains expensive because financing costs remain high. Renting has become more competitive because supply is finally catching up. That's why it no longer makes sense to talk about the housing market like it's one thing. Right now, it's really two different markets responding to two different pressures. Tariffs are back in the headlines again, and whenever they come back, people tend to ask the same question: who wins? I actually think that's the wrong first question. A better question would be, what happens when I follow the money? Because that's usually where the opportunity is. If tariffs push more production inside the United States, then somebody has to build the factories. Somebody has to move the freight, somebody has to supply the electricity, and somebody has to build the warehouses. Eventually, somebody has to build housing for all the workers who support all of it. That's why trade policy eventually becomes a construction story, an energy story, a logistics story, and yes, even a real estate story. Reuters reported on July 24th that the Trump administration imposed new tariffs of 10% and 12.5% on goods from 60 trading partners, expanding the scale of trade costs now flowing through the economy. That does not mean every tariff is good, and it does not mean that every tariff is bad. It means investors need to think beyond the headline and follow second order effects. Who builds, who transports, who supplies power, who finances the expansion, who benefits if domestic production rises. That's usually where the real story is. One thing I've noticed over the past year is that people keep looking for one explanation. One reason why housing is so expensive, one reason groceries cost more, one reason mortgage rates stay high, but economies don't work that way. They're systems. And right now, those systems are all colliding. Interest rates, housing supply, energy prices, trade policy, AI, construction costs, consumer behavior, all of them are pushing on the economy at the same time. That's why things feel weird, because they actually are weird. That isn't a broken market. It's a market that's trying to find a new equilibrium. It's trying to reset without fully breaking. And the more you understand how those systems connect, the better decisions you'll make. Whether you're buying a house, investing, renting, or simply planning for your family's future. I'd love to hear your thoughts. When you think about your family's finances today, what worries you the most? Is it interest rates, housing costs, inflation, energy prices, taxes, or something else? Tell me why down in the comments. I read every single one. If you've enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe. And if you know someone who's interested in business, real estate, technology, or the future of Texas, share this episode with them. I'm Kyle Grimshaw with the Grimshaw Home Group. Thank you for watching another episode of the Texas Market Brief. Until next time, stay informed, stay curious, and remember, the best decisions are made by the people who understand where the world is headed.